Okay, so I am Samantha Hoffman. I'm VP of Chicago Writers Association and Executive Director of Let's Just Write, an Uncommon Writers Conference. We've had several successful events, the CWA Presents events in the past in person. I think many of you have attended them and they were fabulous. And hopefully we'll be able to meet again in real life very soon. But until then, thanks for joining us for CWA Presents Zoom edition. Little business before we get started. Please keep your microphone muted. And you can go to the chat, which is down at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask questions, and we'll be monitoring the questions as we go along. And we'll answer the questions at the end. So we're not going to take questions as we're speaking unless there's something that's really pertinent, and we'll ask that. But ask your questions and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And so let me introduce my friend, Sandra Colbert, who I always want to call Colbert. Sandy is an author and a board member of the Chicago Writers Association. Her third collection of short stories called Reflections and Echoes was published this past week. Congratulations, Sandy.
Thank you.
This follows her two other collections, Chicago Bound and Chicago Bound 2. Sandy is also the author of the Kate Harrison crime series. She's the creator of these CWA Presents events and considers them the most fun part of her responsibilities as a board member. So let me introduce my friend, Sandra Colbert.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Hello and welcome everyone to CWA Presents, the Zoom edition. And like Samantha said, when things improve, we will be doing live interviews again as soon as we possibly can. In the meantime, I have the honor of introducing two of the four authors that were winners of the Chicago Writers Association 2020 Book of the Year Award. Elizabeth Wetmore, author of Valentine, who won for traditional fiction, and Jacqueline Saper, author of From Miniskirt to Hijab, who won for traditional nonfiction. The two other winners, Katie Schultz, the author of Still Come Home, was the winner of the indie fiction, and Mary Lang Solinger, author of From Inspiration to Activism, will be on our next CWA Presents on March 12th. So check our Facebook page in the coming weeks for details as we get closer to that date. In the meantime, let me start with Elizabeth Wetmore. Elizabeth, or Beth, is a graduate of Iowa Writers Workshop. Her works have appeared in a number of literary journals. She is the recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, among other awards and fellowships. But before dedicating her life to writing, Elizabeth tended bar, taught English, drove a cab, and I love this, she painted silos and cooling towers at a petrochemical plant. Those are just a few of her many occupations, and now she can include on her resume a New York Times bestselling author. Our other author tonight is Jacqueline Saper. She was born in Tehran to Iranian and British parents. At 18, she witnessed the civil unrest of the 1979 Iranian Revolution and continued to live in the Islamic Republic during its most volatile and violent times, including the Iran-Iraq War. It was in 1979, under the Ayatollah's regime, that Jacqueline practically overnight went from living a typical carefree life of a teenager, wearing miniskirts and attending high school, to listening to fanatic diatribes and being forced to wear the hijab, and to hiding in the basement with her family as Iraqi bombs fell on her city. She eventually fled to the United States in 1987 with her husband and children. Jacqueline is a CPA, educator, translator, public speaker, and now an author of a truly remarkable narrative. Welcome both Elizabeth and Jacqueline.
Thank you.
If we had an audience, and we do, this is the part where everybody applauds. So we are applauding. When I say that it's an honor to have you both on CWA Presents, it's not an overstatement. Not only are your books remarkable, but the lives that you've led are also quite remarkable. The common thread I found in both of your books is that they're very, very powerful. They're books that stay with you after you finish reading. They're books that make you think. And they truly are amazing works. And I'm really, really thrilled that you're on our program tonight. Elizabeth, let's begin with you. Would you rather I call you Beth? Does it matter?
Fine. Everyone calls me Beth.
Okay, Beth.
Yeah.
Let's begin with you. Tell our viewers, first of all, a little bit about the book Valentine, a brief overview,
Sure.
and then if you would, read a segment from your book.
All right. Valentine is set in 1976 in the oil field town of Odessa, Texas, and it explores the aftermath of a vicious crime against a 14-year-old Mexican-American girl and the lingering effects of this crime on her and her family, as well as the other women and girls in town. The story is told from the point of view of 6 characters, all female, among them an old woman who thinks she's made all the big decisions she's going to make, a young girl whose mother has left town without her, a waitress who hopes to make a better life for herself and her young daughter, and a teenaged girl who's struggling not to let this one terrible moment define the rest of her life. So if it's okay, I think I'll just I'll read from the book for just a few minutes. Is that okay?
Sure. Absolutely.
So this is, I don't think this needs a lot of setup, but this is one of Corinne Shepard's sections. And this particular excerpt is a flashback to October 1929 on the day that the first big oil well came in the Permian Basin. It is October 1929 and Corinne's father is home for lunch. A man who generally hates idle conversation, nattering, he calls it. Today, he can hardly stop talking for long enough to chew his sandwich. The Penn's well has come in, a surface blowout so powerful that pieces of drill pipe, caliche, and rock were blown 50 feet into the air. The well blew at 9 o'clock that morning, and it is still spewing crude oil. Who knows how many barrels are flowing across the desert? The drill operator has no idea when he'll be able to cap it. This here's a historic day, Prestige tells Corinne and her grandmother, Viola Tillman. This is going to put Odessa on the map. Corinne and Viola are already gathering up their hats and gloves when Prestige shakes his head and stuffs the last of his fried egg sandwich into his mouth. An oil well ain't no place for little girls or, he looks at Viola, old ladies. Y'all stay home. I mean it. Corinne is tall for her age, but she still has to sit all the way at the edge of the driver's seat to reach the starter pedal on her father's Model T. They careen across the Llano Estacado, the little girl and old woman bouncing madly on the car seat, while some of Prestige's Herefords look on, their jaws working. The Penn's well is still a mile away when the sky turns black and the ground beneath the car starts to tremble. The air fills with so much debris they have to cover their mouths with handkerchiefs. Lord help us all, Viola says. As it falls back to earth, the oil spills out across the land and covers everything in its path. The purple sage and the blue grama grass that Viola loves, the blue stems and buffalo grasses that come nearly to Corinne's waist. A prairie dog family stands some 30 yards from the growing hole in the ground, their faces lifted as they bark at one another. A small female scutters to the edge of a burrow and peers inside, and Corinne imagines every hidey hole and den within 5 miles filled with confused little creatures who will never know what hit them. But the 50 or so men and boys who stand around the site aren't looking at the grass or the critters or the earth. They are looking at the sky, their faces rapt. It's going to kill every living thing, Viola says. Corinne frowns and sniffs the air while her grandmother sags against the passenger door. Viola's face is pale, her eyes cloudy. She coughs and holds her hand over her mouth and nose. That smell, she says, it's like every cow in West Texas farted at the same time. And our trees, she cries, spotting now a stand of young pecan trees in the direct path of a river of oil. What about them? But it's going to put West Texas on the map, Corrine says, and Daddy says this land's not worth a tinker's damn anyway. Viola Tillman stares at her granddaughter as if she has never seen her before in her life. The Llano Estacado might not be good for anything except stars and space and quiet, the winter songbirds and the sharp smell of post cedars even after a little rain, but she loves it. Together, the old woman and little girl have steered their horses through dry arroyos and creosote forest, then sat quietly and watched a family of javelina forage through a patch of prickly pear. Together, they found and named the largest tree on their property, Galloping Ghost, for the shaggy bark that resembles Red Grange's raccoon coat. Now Viola's face is the color of cold embers and her hands are trembling. Take me home, she tells her granddaughter. Yes, ma'am, Corrine says. Can you drive me back to Georgia? In 3 months, Viola will be dead, and by then her granddaughter will have seen enough of an oil boom to loathe every one of them for the rest of her life. For 3 days, the Penn's well spews an uncontrolled stream of crude oil into the air. A house-sized pool forms in a matter of hours and then quickly breaches the sides, destroying everything in its path. More than 30,000 barrels of oil spill out across the earth before the men get control of the well. And when they finally do, the men stand on the slick platform, their hands and faces stained black. They shout and shake hands and slap each other on the back. We capped her, they tell each other. We got her. I'll stop there.
Wow. What prompted you to write Valentine? Is this something you always wanted to do?
Actually, for a long time, it was the last thing I wanted to do. Valentine is set in my hometown of Odessa, Texas, and I tried for a long time to avoid writing about it. In the way that life is sometimes tricky and complicated, now that I've actually written about my hometown, I can hardly imagine setting anything anywhere else. But it took me a while to get there. And you know, as a kid, I was a kid who liked to sort of sneak around and listen in on other people's conversations. To me, adult conversations were especially delicious. So on summer nights, I'd hover at the edge of the back porch while my mom and her girlfriends and usually a neighbor or two sat in the backyard with cocktails and cigarettes. And I would listen to their stories until someone ran me off. And so I suppose Valentine begins there with those women's voices. But, you know, line by line, draft by draft, the voices became characters and the characters became their own people and their stories became more complicated and my imagination took over. So,
Right.
But
one of my favorite lines in the book is the wind blows like it's got something to prove. Mm-hmm. And I could picture like a crusty old rancher sitting on a porch saying something like that. The voices are very real as you read it, it comes through. Was there anything in the stories that you experienced, or is it mostly imagination?
Mm-hmm. You know, in 1976, I was about the same age as Deborah Ann Pierce. And so Deborah Ann Pierce, more than any other of the characters, I mined my own memories of, you know, riding your bicycle freely around the neighborhood and, you know, being able to disappear, you know, without any of the adults knowing where you were. And, you know, the kind of life of a child in a town like that, you know, in the mid 1970s before cell phones and whatnot, you know. So I probably have more in common with her than any of the other characters. But all of the characters have quite a bit of me in them. And honestly, they're also very much their own people. So
very, very interesting, though. Very, very interesting people, for sure. Let's go over to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, first of all, let me ask you, what exactly is a hijab? I hope I'm pronouncing it properly.
Hijab is an Islamic dress code, and it comes in many different formats. But when I was in Iran, when the Islamic Republic was founded in 1979, it was its strictest format. So I always say I was forced to dress as an Orthodox Muslim woman while I was a Jewish modern teenager. When I was there, hijab, we see many formats of them. Basically, it means modesty and covering yourself. But in Iran of that time, it meant much more. It was a symbol of repression, a symbol of force, and the regime's tightening, on people. Uh, any strand of a hair showing could get you arrested. No makeup, no nail polish. The only thing that I show, anybody, woman can show, was the roundness of their face and their hands up to their wrist. And since the beginning of the revolution, there's a morality police they roam the streets, and they're still around, and they arrest women who are bad hijab, not correctly covered. But the first decade of after the revolution was the strictest time. So I had to cover myself that uh, um, strict, and the only colors I could wear were, or any woman could wear, were brown, navy blue, gray, or black. Obviously, it has evolved since then, and now women can wear colors, and the headscarf has gone a little back, but it's still compulsory. You're forced to wear it. And it is for all women, whether of any ethnicity, any religious background, any nationality. And the girls at the age of 6, when they enter first grade, have to wear it.
That's amazing. I learned a lot reading from your book. Well, let's do the same thing. Could you give us a brief overview of From Miniskirt to Hijab, and then read a part of your book for us?
I was born in early 1960s, and in a country, Iran, that was very secular, modern. There was a monarchy, there was a king, and Iran and the United States had very close relations. I mean, American culture was idolized, and I was named after Jacqueline Kennedy. So I went to a modern school. I wore the latest fashions. I grew up. Uh, my most formative years were in Tehran, a cosmopolitan city. There were about 60 to 80,000 Americans living in Tehran, working there, Israelis, Europeans. And I belong to a very small community of Jewish Iranians who've been in Iran for over 2,500 years. So Iran is a Muslim country, but there is a small minority of Christians, Jews, Baha'is, and Zoroastrians. But I was an anomaly because my mother was British, and in my parents' generation, in the Jewish community 70 years ago, um, um, ethnically different marriages between Europeans and Iranians was unheard of. So I knew of no other family like ours, bicultural. So I and my mom worked for the airlines, and every summer we went to Europe, to England with my English relatives. And I had this identity crisis. I trying to fit in. I was half English, I was Jewish. I always called myself a minority within a minority. But I was raised by devout Muslim maids, home help, because my mom was a career lady. And through them, I learned a lot of Islamic salutations, and which helped me later after the revolution. So as I was trying to figure out who I was and getting comfortable with it, the revolution happened. And when the revolution happened in 1978, it began. Uh, the majority of many of the minorities and people who were associated with a prior regime, a lot of people fled the country. And I stayed behind. I stayed for 8 more years in the Islamic Republic. The country completely changed. And so this is my story, how I stayed. I witnessed discrimination based on my gender and religion. And I had 2 children in Iran. And when we left, my children were 6.5 and 2.5.
Okay.
So the excerpt I'm going to read is when my daughter was born, in 1979, the revolution happened. In February of 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah is a cleric. He came back to Iran and founded the Islamic Republic. That was in February. In November of 1979, I was in the street by chance. I saw the hostage crisis. I was by the American Embassy in Tehran. And in September of 1980, the night that I was delivering my first child, my daughter, at the hospital, the Iran-Iraq war broke out. The Iraqis, which are neighbors to Iran, invaded Iranian soil. And at that time, I lived in the south of the country in another city called Shiraz, which was closer to the border. So that was an eventful night. So the excerpt I'm going to read is now 1986. The war lasted 8 years. So now we're in the 6th year of the war. And it wasn't only a war, over about.
Keep on talking.
She froze. She's going to have to sign back in.
Okay.
She's having some problems with her internet connection.
Right. Yeah, she was saying because of the ice, she was having issues. I do have to say, I know there were a lot of reasons why she had to stay there. Her husband was studying at medical school. Her parents were still there. Her father really didn't want to leave. They had a lot of family members who gradually were leaving, but she stayed for a number of reasons until the whole situation did get really, really bad. There were a lot of executions. They had friends that were executed. And it wasn't easy to leave. When you read that part of the book, it's very nerve-wracking how they did get out of the country. It was very, very hard. She could not get a passport. It was just a very, very difficult time for them. But she made it, and eventually her parents came over and the rest of her family. So they had a happy ending.
She's been here?
How long has she been here?
Do you know?
I forget offhand. I want to say 86 or so. It was in the late 80s that she was finally able to come over, 87. But they ended up in California for a while, and actually they ended up they had relatives in Texas. So there's a connection with Beth.
So while we're waiting, can I ask Beth a question?
Sure.
Beth, do you have a favorite character in your book?
Oh gosh, I really, it's funny. The answer is yes, I do. I do have favorite characters, but they change according to sort of my mood and my temperament on any given day. I mean, obviously, I have a great affection for Glory, the character who opens and closes the book, and her enormous strength and courage. I have a really soft spot for Corrine Shepherd. But really, if you asked me on any given day, it would be a completely different answer. They are, each of them, are really important to me in completely different ways.
Sure.
Well, we got Jacqueline back.
I truly apologize. My internet is choppy tonight.
That's okay.
So I'm going to read a part of chapter 25. This is about, it's 6 years into the war. It's 1986, and my daughter is going to school. That's my 6-year-old going to school. So I'm going to very briefly read a part of that chapter. It's called Welcome to First Grade. My daughter Leora turned 6 in September 1986. 2 days later, she started first grade at an all-girls elementary school. She was the eldest of my two children. My son Daniel was 2 at the time. Leora's first day of school in the Islamic Republic of Iran was a new and uncharted experience for our family. Today was also the first day of her life when she wore the hijab. Leora's school uniform consisted of navy blue pants and a manteau, long, shapeless gray button-down overcoat that came down to her knees. A large navy head cover, known as the maqna'eh, covered every strand of her hair. The cloth extended from the top of her head to the middle of her chest. As her mother, I had to help my daughter get dressed for school. I felt deeply upset. Why do they subject such young children to wearing the hijab in a building where all students and personnel are female? The walls are tall. No one can peek inside. But more so, why the hijab for my Jewish child? Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, a lot had changed. By then, gender segregation was the norm. Males and females had to be separated in the schools, on the beaches, in the buses, and at hair salons. In the school courtyard, Leora and I saw long lines of young girls, all dressed exactly alike. Only their facial features and hands were visible. On the far end, the principal stood on a raised platform and spoke earnestly into the loudspeaker. I squeezed Leora's little hand and gave her a reassuring look. Parents, who were mostly the mothers, were invited to join their children for the first hour of school. I stood beside Leora in line, and we followed her new classmates and their parents to the classroom. The room looked colorless and felt cheerless. It had no joy. The parents and their children sat on iron school benches. A faded and yellow curtain covered the window. The only thing in mint condition was a framed picture above the chalkboard of the Supreme Leader. His piercing eyes and omnipotent presence could be felt at all times. The teacher, dressed in a manteau and a black maqna'eh, stood in front of the class and said, "Welcome to first grade." My attention turned to Leora, who quietly sat beside me. I looked into her wide eyes and thought, at least she has no idea that education used to be different. During the reign of the Shah, Shah means king, I wore cute dresses with white socks and shiny shoes. Our maid would comb and style my hair in braids or a ponytail, or keep the sides in place with colorful barrettes. My teachers wore pencil skirts, chiffon shirts, and high-heeled shoes. Their hair was styled after Queen Farah's beehive, which was fashionable at the time. They were kind and smiled. We learned morality stories with underlying principles of righteousness, love, and mutual respect. We recited beautiful poems by Persian poets from books with colorful pictures. One day, Leora told us that the teacher had drawn some bottles on the chalkboard and asked the girls if anyone had them in their houses. Apparently, the state officials, through the teachers, were using children to investigate which parents had any banned alcoholic beverages. Leora had a habit of using the front of her maqna'eh as a handy makeshift tissue to wipe her nose. Therefore, the front panel of her head and chest covering was always dirty. The back of her neck became sore from the heat rash that developed under her maqna'eh. An essential part of her education was safety. The children had to make trenches in the schoolyard so that they could hide in them when the Iraqi warplanes appeared from above. I never understood how much security a hole in the ground would provide. The thought of not being with my child during an air raid was too painful even to imagine. Leora began to kiss the posters of the Ayatollahs that were displayed everywhere we went. She had learned to wave her fists in the air and chant "Death to America" and "Death to Israel." She had no idea where these places were, but Leora knew she and her classmates had to wish for their destruction. During recess, Leora and her friends would play a game where they formed a funeral procession and carried an object over their heads, pretending it was a martyr being taken to the cemetery.
So they were working on the children at a very, very young age.
Yes.
Amazing. How did you come to the decision to write the book? Was it a difficult decision?
You know, I came to the States in '87. It was a harrowing, it wasn't a normal journey to get here. And I wanted to put everything behind. I wanted to become American. I went to college. I studied accounting. But something inside me, the story wouldn't leave me alone. I couldn't calm down. Every opportunity, something erupted in me and it wanted to come out. And I kept on telling myself, I'm not a writer. I have a logical brain. I'm doing math. I'm not a creative person. I can't write. I don't know how to write. But I was very uncomfortable. So for the past 25 years, I was just jotting down ideas and what came to mind. I mean, unfortunately, none of these things would go away. It was in my memory. One day, you know, I live in a nice suburb of Illinois in Chicago. I woke up in the middle of the night, the police, dreaming that the police was chasing me because I didn't have my hijab on here in Chicago. So it wasn't leaving me alone. And I knew I had to bring it out to calm down. And my father passed away in 2014. And his passing was a shaking to me because my children grew up in America, have grown up in America, and they have no idea about Iran, no recollection of their childhood. And the story was getting lost. And because I was so unusual, being a religious minority, having lived in Iran for so long, being from a unique generation that has fully experienced the monarchy, the revolutionary, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, all of this came together and I started to write. And to my surprise, the words just were jumping on the page. It just poured out. And I had written much more, but I cut it down. It took me about, a lot happened in between. I stopped a while, but overall it took me about 4.5, 5 years to finish.
Okay. Beth, let's go back to you. What has been the reaction to your book? I mean, I know it was like going back to a different place in time, once again, similar to Jacqueline. How has the reaction been? Do you hear from people down there?
Yeah, I mean, in general, people who have taken the time to send emails, and I've been really surprised at how many people have taken that time, have been really positive. It's not a part of the country that you see a lot of in the literature, and what books we do have about West Texas and the Permian Basin tend to focus on the lives of men and boys. So I've heard from a lot of people, but particularly women who have been really gratified to sort of see their lives reflected in these characters. So it's honestly been rewarding in ways that I would never ever have been able to predict.
Yeah, I learned a lot reading your book. Like you said, there's not a lot written about it, and it's kind of a almost obscure, subject, but it was fascinating what I did learn. But the women also, they're not just, they were fighters and survivors. Mm-hmm. And we could identify with every character in your book. It's an amazing work. Jacqueline, let me ask you the same question. What was the reaction to your book? And have you heard from other Iranians?
The book has taken me on a wonderful journey, and it keeps on continuing. It's so rewarding. And Zoom has helped me reach a lot of people which I would have never dreamed about. A few months ago, I had a Zoom program for women in India Chamber of Commerce and Industry around along 17 cities in India, and I brought it to show and tell. I have some show and tell. They planted a tree in my honor in West Bengal, India.
Oh,
So I
that's
thought
wonderful.
that is so rewarding. And then I talked to an audience in Sydney, Australia, who gave me a certificate for talking in Sydney through Zoom, which was 2 a.m. my time in Chicago. I'll be talking for people in Turkey next week. I have spoken for universities. My book is being taught at Marymount University in DC and Indiana University in Bloomington as part of the curriculum. I have spoken for Harvard, University of Chicago, Middle Eastern section in Farsi. I have spoken to many universities, and it's just so rewarding. I'm going to speak for Tel Aviv University in Israel in March, and I am very humbled by people's interest, whether academic or non-academic, because the book is very easy to read. It's,
yes, it is.
The story.
It's very powerful too. It's both books, like I said, are very, very powerful. And Iran today, do you think you can return, and do you want to return?
I am part of me with technology. You don't have to physically be somewhere. You can, I volunteer as a translator for the National Immigrant Justice Center. I work with refugees, asylum. I work with supervising attorneys, translating for refugees and asylum seekers. So I need to be updated with what's happening in the country. And no, you can never take it out of you. This is my hometown. As Elizabeth said, she grew up in Odessa for 19 years. I grew up in Tehran for 18 years. It's my hometown. So obviously I'm interested, but with technology, you can still be there.
Right, absolutely. I see that we do have some chats coming through. Before we move on to the questions from viewers, is there anything you would like to share with Beth? And Beth, is there anything you'd like to share with Jacqueline?
Well,
I was so struck by how in your book, seeing your daughter go to school, and have to wear the hijab, what an impression it made on you. And one of the things I thought about with my own book was how, how deeply these women in my book loved their daughters, how these women without a lot of resources or a lot of overt power, certainly not a lot of economic power or education, wanted so much more for their daughters than they had for themselves, and it made me think, about when my own son was born. And, I went through this strange experience where things that I had apparently been able to put up with for a really long time, when I suddenly saw my son, right, being subjected to them, it was a different animal. And I wondered, I wondered if you really saw that as the primary turning point for yourself, seeing your daughter.
That was the impetus for us to leave. And I think both of our books have the theme of survival, women's empowerment. And I would love to one day after COVID go out with you for lunch or coffee, and we can discuss our books in detail.
Oh yeah, I'm coming with. Yeah,
let's do it. That sounds great. Lunch sounds fantastic.
Like I said, there really is a lot. I mean, granted, one book's nonfiction and the other's fiction, but there really are a lot of themes that run through both books that are so intertwining. Samantha, do we have any questions and chats that we want to cover?
Well, Mary Solinger asked Jacqueline, how did your children adjust when you arrived from?
They were very young. My daughter quickly, we first went to Houston, Texas, and she adjusted so fast. They were very young, so I think that helped. My son was just 2, didn't know anything, and my daughter quickly adjusted. I should, my book should be From Miniskirt to Hijab to Cowboy Boots, because I went to Texas. But no, fortunately they adjusted, and I think they were too young, so they did well.
Probably, yeah, probably easier for them than for
Right.
you.
And my daughter, actually, she's an attorney now,
Oh,
so everything worked out well.
that's wonderful. And then Shanti wants to know if you have relatives in Iran and if you have returned.
No, I have not returned because the community that I once knew does not exist anymore. As I said, I was part of a religious minority group. They have a majority of them have left. The community I knew is mostly in the United States now. They've gathered here. And I have not returned. There's no reason for me to return. It's not the community I used to know. The country has changed. If I go back, it's not the country I knew. It's very much changed.
So you don't have family there?
My husband has family.
Oh, and tell me how you learned to speak English so well.
Well, as I said, my mom's English.
Oh,
And I went to a very good school. I went to a school that heavily emphasized, I went to a Jewish day school. The regular schools ended at 2 p.m. My school ended at 5 p.m. And half the day was English. The other half was our physics, math was in Farsi. But by Ministry of Education mandated us to learn a few hours of Arabic per week. And we studied Hebrew. So I was exposed to 4 languages at the same time.
Wow, I'm impressed.
And I spent my summers in England. So fortunately, when we came to America, I did not have a language barrier.
very good. And I have a question for Beth. How old was your son when you moved here from Texas?
Hank is a native Chicagoan.
Oh,
So yeah. I left Texas when I was 18, but I didn't have my son until I was in my mid 30s. So yeah. So he's our native Chicagoan.
yeah. And so how do you compare Chicago with Texas, West Texas?
How do I compare it?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Well, I think on the face of it, they're just completely different animals. But I will tell you what West Texas and Chicago have in common. Both communities are filled with good, decent, hardworking people who are really trying to just on a daily basis keep a roof over their family's head and do the best they can. Obviously the economy is more complicated in Chicago. In Odessa, the economy is completely dependent on oil and gas, and so that's very different. That makes it a very different kind of town. If someone wants to know Cubs or Sox, Cubs. So, although I've been Sox curious for a really long time because I feel like for me, actually, I should have probably rooted for the Sox. They would have been more sort of in keeping with my sort of general temperament, but now it's too late and I'm a Cubs fan. The whole family is. So,
You're in Rogers.
but no, I mean, in that regard, they're very different. But in a lot of ways, they're very similar. One of the things that I'm struck by is if you when I go home to West Texas, and tell people I live in Chicago, they're like, Chicago, oh my God, but when I come to Chicago and I tell people I'm from West Texas, they're like, oh my God, West Texas, it's a totally different world. And, but the people are more or less the same wherever you go by and large, so.
Right. Well, did all of the different occupations you have, including painting silos, how did that help you with your book? I mean, you must have had a lot to draw on.
Yeah, I mean, you hear, I'm 53 and this is my debut novel, you hear these stories about these, 25-year-old, young people who get these multi-million-dollar deals and write, just an absolutely beautiful, wise novel that really sort of, beautifully illustrates, the human heart in conflict with itself, right? That thing that Faulkner said literature is about, the human heart in conflict with itself. And then you have people like me who just took a really long time to figure it out and really had to, get every bit of wisdom to bring to my book, honestly, through experience. So all of those jobs, recently I had the opportunity to sort of figure out how many years I spent waiting tables. I think a grand total of about 15 years waiting tables and bartending as an adult. So, that's just that's an industry that just has a stories sort of drifting across your reality every day,
Yes.
always, but I think all of those jobs really, gave me a real understanding for the realities of some of my characters. Every man in my family has worked in the oil patch. My father worked for 30 years in the petrochemical plant outside my hometown, and that was compared to roughnecking a stable, well-paying, and relatively safe job. So this is something I think about a lot, when I'm hanging out here in Chicago with my North Side friends who are dreaming of a post-petroleum age, right? What do you do with entire communities where the only way people can make a living, is by, harvesting oil and gas, so yeah, I think those jobs have really served me well, as have my sort of life experiences in general.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in your book. And like I said, it's beautifully written too. So, Samantha, do we have any more questions that are?
I have another question, and it's for both Jacqueline and Beth. What are you working on next?
Yes.
I can answer that. I would like to write a second book, and started writing it. And it's also a true story, but I'm gonna be more creative with this one because it's going to be my parents' romance love story, which begins from just post World War II, 1947, and how they met, because it's an incredibly unique and unusual story. And I have documents, I have their love letters. My father was an exchange, my father was a foreign student. Talking about Elizabeth's book, my father studied oil engineering. He was at an oil refinery in the south of Iran, and they sent him on a scholarship to the University of Birmingham in England. And at a school dance, he met my mom. They met. And anyhow, when my father went back for 2 years, they corresponded. I have those letters. And finally, my mom got on a plane in 1951. She went to Iran and they got married. And it's a very unusual story because in the early 1950s, Iran had a contentious relations with Britain and US. There was a coup there. So there's a lot of historical background. It needs a lot of research. I'm writing that book.
Wonderful. That's great. I'm so glad you're doing that. What about you, Beth? What do you have coming up after this?
Oh, well, I've been working on short stories for the last few months.
Yeah.
It's a form that I love and admire, and has felt like a good place to sort of land in the middle of the pandemic, when I frankly am having a lot of trouble focusing on things. I've also, when someone asked me in an interview the other day, what are you working on? And I kind of deadpanned, you mean other than surviving the pandemic? I've actually, I'm journaling a lot, and working on short stories, but mostly, I'm trying to help steer my family and my friends through this time, and, spending a lot of time sort of being available to them, honestly. So
yeah, and hopefully this will pass.
Oh, of course it will. Yeah, this is all gonna pass, but I'm okay with it, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm sure that I'm not getting as much work done as I ought to be, but I'll be honest with you. I'm just, my community has felt incredibly important to me, particularly in the last few months. So
Right. Now, you were at the Iowa workshop. You want to tell us a little bit about that? I know that a lot of writers are interested in that.
Sure. Well, I should say that, in a lot of ways, my 2 years at Iowa was more of sort of an exception to the sort of general trajectory of my life rather than just sort of a natural extension. I know that a lot of people who go to the Iowa Writers Workshop, graduate from a BA, they get a BA in creative writing or English, and then they apply for graduate school, and then they're off to the races. That was not my experience. I went to Iowa at 33. I didn't start writing until I was in my late 20s, not fiction. And on the day that they called me to tell me that I had gotten into the workshop, I was literally heading out the door to my waitressing shift. So for me, the workshop was really a kind of anomaly in the sort of larger trajectory of my life. But of course, like anyone who goes to a program like that, maybe even a little more so because of, how the work I had been doing before I got there, the idea of having 2 years, right, to focus on my writing was really such a remarkable thing. And to be, frankly, surrounded by people who thought that writing mattered, I think for those of us who are the first to go of our families to go to college, or who don't grow up in families or communities where, one writes as a way of paying the bills, that can feel really odd. And so it was a real gift. And of course, I got to study with some of the people who I most admire in the world. Marilyn Robinson was my thesis advisor, and reading her work and sitting in her class really, really changed my life, not just professionally, but personally. And her sort of deep affection for sort of the nobility of the human spirit, was something that made a big impression on me as a writer. James Allen McPherson was on my committee, and just a kind and brilliant man. And all of these people had in common, a passion for and respect for the written word that was, for me, a remarkable thing to find myself surrounded by.
Right. Samantha, do we have any other questions from our chat room?
No, we're good. But so let me just say thanks to you, Sandy, for this wonderful interview, and Beth and Jacqueline. And we'll have another CWA Presents on March 12th, right? And we also have another Cocktails and Conversation, which will be on March 7th. So
Right.
lots
And
of.
I also, in closing, I want to thank all of our viewers who showed up tonight. And once again, thank both of these incredible authors. I am just, it's not an overstatement to say I'm honored that you're on CWA Presents, because you're both incredible, remarkable women and remarkable writers. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
And thank you for this CWA thing. That's amazing. And I've already spent my gift card. I finally got all my books off of.
My reward is up there on the shelf.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Everyone take care.
Thank you.
Honor. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye.